Good day, Ryk. Thank you so much for speaking with us today and taking the time to meet with us from the Talking Point group. I just want to give some background about you. You are the owner and founder of Indigo Sky, which is a niche human-centered consulting company that specializes in uncovering the hidden potential and purposes in human beings and human organization systems. This is where we see the synergy between the Talking Point and Indigo Sky.
And the Talking Point's business foundation model is built on the biopsychosocial model of health, which focuses on the root causes of mental health. And one of our focus areas is stress and burnout, and within employees. And this is where our paths crossed with Indigo Sky. So in the mental health industry, there's often a debate on mental wellness versus mental well-being. Should we differentiate between the two, Ryk?
I would say, well, first, also say thank you for having me on the call here. Really appreciate that. No, most definitely there's a difference between mental health, mental well-being, and just wellness. I think there's an important thing to discover about the physicality of our humanness. So when we talk about human beings, we talk about whole complex human beings, not just pieces of that. And the mental space, of course, is part of that. So when we talk about wellness, for instance, very often it refers to the physicality, our physical bodies, of course, which includes things like our diets, how do we sleep enough, do we rest enough, do we eat quality foods, do we exercise adequately, and so forth. And that, in a sense, is almost a foundation for mental health too, because it's like having the best car in the world, but you don't have any more fuel in it. So you have to look at the whole thing to make it function optimally and for high performance. So when we talk about well-being, we include many more elements. For instance, we include things like a construct known as noble purpose, which is all about meaning and purpose in our lives. Do we fulfill that? There's the physicality that I've just spoken about. There's things like our goal directedness, as an example. There are important elements of well-being that includes things like quality relationships. So relationships are also a very important resource for us to become well people. There are things like our goal directedness, as an example. So there are quite a few elements involved in well-being, which separates that from just wellness. Of course, a big part of that also has to do with our mental well-being, of course. Things like mindfulness practices, as an example, how we deal with stresses and so forth, because those are important aspects that either gives us energy or consumes energy, depending how we deal with that.
Okay, so but as an employer, how do I bring the mental health part into my business as the financial, the legal, the ethical, the responsibility of an employer and the responsibility of the employee? How do I bring all those things into my business to create the well-being environment?
I think maybe a good way to start is for an organization or a leader in an organization first to understand, we call them mental models, how we really think about and what are the true beliefs we hold dear to ourselves in terms of how how important is well-being for us. Many organizations have well-being programs, but they outsource that, and sometimes it becomes a tick in the box exercise. I think the other challenge with this also has to do with, it's really hard for many people to quantify a financial business case. And if they make an investment in that, how do I actually know that I'm getting good value for money? So it tends to be moved to the back shelf. When we talk about mental health, it becomes that thing that HR is supposed to do, as opposed to creating a culture of that. That's the first challenge, is to get leadership to change that mental model about how important people really are and what contributions they can make, especially in the future world of work. To do that and to actually take it into an organization, we use a diagnostic instrument, which is the combination of about 15 years of research through 3 different international universities, well researched with all the constructs, reliable and valid scientific instruments with good proper survey design behind that actually quantifies what mental state health state looks like in the organization. When I say quantify, literally calculating the human factor risk and the costs of that, of things like, for instance, presenteeism. When we talk about presenteeism, this is an important thing, because when people are not well, as an example, they show up for work but it's just the body that arrives, and sometimes in not the best state. And of course, it has severe impact on productivity levels and so forth. It impacts things like quality decision making. It impacts how relationships at work are forged and so forth. So it's really important to do a proper diagnostic of the organization. And we do that through proper statistical modeling, in which case we can highlight what are the building blocks, which are also well researched, of mental health. What are the root causes of either mental health or mental ill health for that matter? What are the priority root causes? And then, of course, comes with that some intervention design. And having said that, I think any HR executive or OD practitioner or CEO who understands the true value that people bring into organizations will eventually end up with a roadmap that gives them a very clear line of sight on what needs to be optimized in their workplace to create optimum workplaces that, of course, reduces mental issues and so forth. And with that, of course, comes not just hypothetical and productivity levels, but actually proven root causes to productivity levels and sustainable business practices. So the diagnostic is the way to start, but that's half the story. The other story, of course, once you have a proper diagnostic, is to actually implement properly fit for purpose interventions and solutions to address mental health issues.
So now we know the employer needs to be worried about the mental well-being of their staff. Why is it not the employee's responsibility to come to work in a good mental state and do their job?
Well, I want to say it's actually a dual responsibility. In the first place, very clearly so from the mandate of the World Health Organization, and not just them, but that mandate has been clearly translated into South African terms with the King 4 governance framework, which includes elements of stakeholder management and by its own inference, of course, employees. There is a clear mandate that it's a compelling case for businesses to create optimal workplaces. And when we talk about optimal workplaces, we mean it's not just the absence of infirmity, it's also the presence of the positive, okay? And so that puts a responsibility on an employer to physically and proactively create optimal workplaces. And there are, of course, tools and mechanisms to diagnose that and to measure that. There is also a responsibility for the employees. I mean, employers can do as much as they can in terms of creating an optimal workplace, but it's also true to say that we have accountability for how we live our lives and for the choices we make. I don't think it would be fair to say that an employer has a responsibility to force the employee on what he eats, how often he sleeps, what kind of exercise regime they do, and so forth. So that becomes the accountability for the physicality of well-being for the employee. And of course, thirdly, I believe that every person has an own accountability for their own personal development. And from that perspective, the choices we make, we have to bear the consequences of that. And that's for me, therefore, a joint responsibility between the employer and the employee. However, having said that, if you enter a toxic workplace and it's a place of pure survival and so forth, it becomes really difficult because there is, of course, an interplay between homework and homework interference. And we are whole human beings. We're not employees, and then we go home, we're human beings again, and like that. So we have to think about how do we integrate that as well. But there's a joint responsibility.
So what you're saying is that is it possible or impossible for an employee to, when as soon as they step onto the business's property, are they supposed to leave that part of themselves in the car or at home? Or how does the workplace integrate with your personal life?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. We sometimes say to people, when, let's say, for instance, your wife is very ill and she suffers from cancer and so forth, when you enter the clock station, the cancer doesn't suddenly stop. And tonight, when you go home again, suddenly it starts again. It does beg a question to organizations about their true, and again, I'm referring to a mental model here of what is their legitimacy in the environment. In other words, big corporates especially are very prone to taking care of the communities in which they operate, because the people that work for them also come from that community. So we are whole human beings. We are human beings first, and secondly, we are employees. So it is important to recognize that it's a fantasy to believe that when somebody comes through the gate, all the family problems are left at home. It's never the case. Because it lingers in the mind, it consumes energy. People worry about things like that. So it provides a case for people to pay attention to that, to employees when they have these issues, and to feel safe to speak about that and to find the right resources. Many organizations has practices in place like employee assistance programs and for instance, reference organizations where people can talk to and counseling and so forth. That's available. But I think it's important that line management starts to pay attention to these issues and to become more aware of that, and to also work with their own mental models about this idea that employees must leave their nonsense at home, because they are whole human beings. They are not, they're not human doings when they come to work. They're many human beings, and they bring their whole package with them.
Okay. Is there a reason why a possible employee might just always want to play the victim in certain instances when it portrays to their mental well-being at work?
I guess I guess there's a question around whether we choose to live our lives the way we're supposed to live them, or do we choose to adopt a victimhood mentality to keep on blaming other people? And I guess in a perverse way, there's also such a thing as a willingness to change. And an employer can take it so far and provide all the necessary options and opportunities and so forth, and support packages for employees to perform well and to look after their well-being. But it remains their choice. And I guess for some people, it in a perverse way serves them to keep doing what they're doing and hold on to bad habits. For instance, I mean, we know smoking is not healthy, consuming too much sugar is not healthy, but those are choices people make, and you can hardly blame the employer for that. So it's also about how do we help employees then make better choices by helping them understand the consequences. But there's always this question about a willingness to change from their side, and some people will not make that choice. Some people will continue smoking despite being diagnosed with some lung disease and so forth. So you can support it to a point, and that's your accountability. But there is, of course, that accountability for the employee to make a different decision and get a different outcome for themselves too.
Okay, that makes sense.
And is there any tool to help an employee with a stressful work environment?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we've noticed is, especially organizations that's under a high load, with high workload environments. We talk about an innovative world and Industry 4 and the future world of work and all wonderful things, and talk about innovation and all sorts of things. But if an employee finds himself in a stressful environment, it becomes very hard to think creatively. It becomes very hard to think about innovation and so forth. And of course, that leaves the employer out in the cold in terms of innovation. So some tools that helps employees think differently would be a tool that we call it the Amygdala Hijack. Very simple tool. And it's a simple tool that when we find ourselves in a stressful situation, let's say, for instance, the announcement of a big change program, or a retrenchment that's looming, or perhaps an employee has been dismissed for some disciplinary issues, as an example, whatever the case may be. There is a trigger event that happens that brings about a stressful response, and then it's about paying attention to that. So what happens in the brain literally is, once that trigger event occurs, the first step is to pay attention to and noticing that this is a trigger event. And you'll notice that in the body. You'll notice that because there'll be something, a clutching of the throat, or a tightening of the chest, or a knot in the stomach, or a flush in the face. Some trigger event, maybe a stressful announcement in a meeting, or some conflict that arising, as an example. That's the trigger events, to pay attention to that. Then the choice starts to happen about what do we do with this. Now you can either react to it by simply reacting to it, or pause by simply being aware of what's happening to me. This is a stressful event. And by pausing, we call it the Amygdala Hijack. It allows for that space to occur, where we literally just take a few deep breaths, don't react immediately. And what happens is we remove the fear. We go from a fight, flight, and freeze reaction in the limbic brain and the amygdala parts of the brain to a more informed response, which of course always has better results than reacting to something. And in that space is where we actually find ourselves again, where we ground ourselves again, and we are able to move out of the amygdala back into the prefrontal cortex with a bit more oxygen, so to speak, as well, so that we can actually come with a better response and a more informed response that gets us different results. It's a very simple technique, starting, in other words, by noticing first the body reaction. That's is a trigger event, deciding to pause, not to react immediately, take a few deep breaths, and then come up with an informed response. To summarize that, so we call it the Amygdala Hijack. Very useful for people that find themselves in stressful situations, having to respond at the moment. Just not do that too quickly. Pretty simple tool to use.
We hear the word boundaries often. Does this relate to any mental well-being aspects?
I think boundary management is an important personal skill. And for me, what it means in terms of relationship to mental health means that it's very easy when we think about what matters most to us. Very often we want to shine, we want to perform, and we want to please people and so forth. And very often we end up saying yes to things that we should say no to. But of course, by default, if we say yes for something, it means we say no to something else. And so we end up wondering, how did I get here? How do I get to this immense amount of work where my job scope crept up to this amount of things that I wasn't supposed to be doing? And of course, we then get really stressed out because of that. So learn to say no, I think, is an important aspect. And when I say learn to say no, I do not mean let's not collaborate or let's not work and bust the silos. Of course, it includes that. It's more important to just make sure that people understand where your boundaries are, what your capabilities are, and to be honest about that. So learning to say no is an important attribute of looking after one's mental well-being, precisely because people learn to respect what you say yes to, what you say no to, and so forth. It does not include, of course, not working together with people and not collaborating with people. That's, of course, really important, but it's about being aware and being honest about one's own capabilities and time and what is within your scope of work and what not. Because by default, of course, whatever you say yes to, you say no to something else. And by doing so, very often we end up with a pile of work that really isn't part of our responsibility, and we end up being really stressed out because of that, because we simply haven't learned to say no. And maybe the other trick about boundaries is it's also the way we say no, to be very honest about what I'm capable of doing and what's it doing to me. So it often leads to difficult conversations, which of course is a whole different topic altogether, that also helps with mental health if we get them right.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, Ryk. You have a second talk with us on the 20th of October, in which we're going to discuss the trends in mental health, some more tools, a bit more about mindfulness, and the closing cycle of mental well-being in business. I think we're all very excited to hear more about those topics.
Well, also thanks to you for inviting me for this conversation. It's been wonderful to meet with you again and to share some of the ideas. Looking forward to the next conversation. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ryk.